Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Okay, are there any questions before we start? Okay, so I take it there are no questions. Okay. Now, as far as there are just a few things I would like to share with you here very quickly, and that is the office hours. I have office hours on Mondays and Wednesdays from 3 to 4. So please take advantage of that. If you have any questions, you can always bring them with you to office hours, and I'll be more than happy to answer them for you. So please make sure that you do take advantage of the office hours. And the other thing, as far as the recording of these lectures is concerned, you can always find them on YouTube. So just put my name on YouTube, Nasser Douala, and as I said, you will get a lot of the recordings on international economics. So use that as well. And if you have any questions, always let me know. If there is something that, any questions with the recordings itself, or if you can't access it, or any questions along those lines, then, get in contact with me and hopefully we can resolve them. Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to continue from where we left last time. Now, remember, last time we were talking about the effect of a tariff on the economic welfare of the country. In other words, once a country imposes a tariff, how will that impact the economy of that particular country? And we said that there are basically three major players that we need to concern ourselves with, and those are number one, consumers, number two, domestic producers, and number three, the government. Because those are the ones that will be affected by the tariff, of course. And the second thing, we said that we need some tools at our disposal that will help us determine the effect of this tariff. Now, what are those tools? Can someone tell me very quickly? Anyone?
Was it the ERP and the NR?
I can't hear you, by the way.
Sorry. Was it the ERP or the NRP? Or is that like, that's all? My bad.
Still can't hear you. Anyway, anyone else? What are the main tools that we need to help us determine what the effect of the tariff would be? How are we going to measure, in other words, the effect of this tariff? What are the things that we need to know?
The effective tariff rate?
Yeah, but how are we going to determine the effect of this tariff on the economy? What type of tools do we need to help us measure this?
Demand and supply?
Yes, more specifically, what? More specifically, consumer surplus and producer surplus. That's basically what we need to help us determine what the impact of the tariff is going to be on that country that happens to impose tariffs. Okay. Now, the next thing, of course, that we need to know is the model. What type of model are we going to use? And if you remember last time, we said we're going to start with a small country model. Why a small country? Because it's very, very simple to find the impact of the tariff when a small country is imposing that tariff. And the reason is simply because this small country will not have any influence on the world price. It will be a price taker. It will take the price as given, and it cannot change that world price in any way. Therefore, the supply curve that this small country will face will be a horizontal line. That's the supply curve, horizontal, which would mean that the country is obviously a price taker when the supply curve is horizontal. It cannot affect the price of that country. We say that the supply is perfectly elastic. And you can see it from here. You can see, for example, that the supply curve that this country has is a horizontal line. Given the world price, the country can decide to purchase any amount at that price. The price will not change. So that's basically the essence of the model. A small country whereby this small country will face a perfectly elastic supply for its imports, and this country will be a price taker, and this country will not be able to affect the price of imports. Okay, so now let's put this into a demand supply model. The first thing, of course, we need to do is we need to draw the demand that the country faces, which is downward sloping, and the supply, which is upward sloping. And the point of intersection will determine the autarky equilibrium. In other words, this would be the autarky price, which would be equal to, let me make this a little bit larger so we can see it, which would be equal to 9,500, and the quantity that will be bought and sold will be equal to 50. So this would be the autarky position. Now let's say the country decides to engage in trade, and when that happens, the world price now is no longer 9,500, but it is only 8,000. This would be the world price. So what do I do here? I come to my model and I'm going to pinpoint where the $8,000 mark is, because that's the world price. I will know. I will be given what the world price is. So I'm going to draw a line that is horizontal, which would correspond to $8,000. And I will call this line the domestic supply plus the world supply. So you see, previously this was the domestic supply. Now, once we engage in free trade, this will become my world and domestic supply. So to be more accurate, the world and domestic supply will start from here, will go up here, and then become horizontal at that point. So all of this would be the relevant portion of the domestic and world supply. Okay, now once we know that supply, we'll say, okay, when the world price is 8,000, how much will this country purchase? And this will be determined by the supply and demand. So where they intersect, which is right here at point F, this will tell me the free trade equilibrium. In other words, the country will purchase exactly 80 units of that product and will pay $8,000 for each unit. Here, of course, we're talking about autos. So the automobile, price of the automobile under free trade will be 8,000. And we will purchase 80 automobiles, or 80,000, or 80 millions, or it depends on how we're measuring this. Okay, that's the first step. The second step is to determine how much will domestic producers produce at this price. This again will be determined by the world price and the supply curve. Because at 8,000, domestic producers will only produce 20 units. So now I know how much the country will consume and how much the country will produce. And by taking the difference between them, I will know exactly how much the country will import. So at 8,000, the country will consume or purchase 80 autos. And at 8,000, the country will produce 20 autos. Therefore, at this price, you have excess demand, which means that the country now will import how many automobiles?
60.
Very good, 60, which is 80 minus 20. That's exactly the amount of imports. Now, let's say that the automobile industry was successful to lobby the government to place a tariff on imported autos, and the government agrees to impose $1,000 tariff per auto imported. Okay, knowing that information, what would be the new world price after the tariff? Anyone?
9,000.
9,000. Very good. Which is $8,000, the world price without tariff, plus $1,000 tariff. So now my new world supply plus tariff will be at 9,000. So again, I'm going to come right here and draw my new supply curve, which will represent the world price plus the tariff. And I'm going to do the same. I'm going to say, okay, at 9,000, how much will consumers purchase? And you can see from the demand and new supply, consumers are willing to purchase 60 autos. Also, at this price, how much will domestic firms produce? Again, according to the domestic supply curve and the world price plus tariff, where both intersect, will tell me exactly how many autos domestic producers would produce, which is 40. So now, after the tariff, how many cars will this small country import?
20.
20.
20, very good, 20, which is 60 minus 40. So now we have everything in place. Now, the next question is, after imposing the tariff, what has happened to imports? Come on, very quickly. Someone answer that.
It went down.
Went down. By how much?
40, right?
40.
40. Very good. Excellent. So you're a lot quicker than me. So you're getting better at this. That's good. 40. That's the change in imports. So obviously the tariff is going to reduce trade. The tariff will reduce imports and exports. So this is basically one answer, one thing that the model is answering for us. The model is telling us that, hey, if you impose a tariff, your imports are going to be hurt. Trade is going to be hurt. And this is exactly what this model is telling us. Okay. The second thing, second question. What would be the change in consumer surplus as a result of the tariff? Come on, again, you should be able to answer this very quickly. We went over this, so if you were paying attention when we talk about consumer surplus, you should be able to determine what the change is.
Sorry, what was the question?
What would be the change in consumer surplus after the tariff?
It goes down.
Is it
Goes down, yes, but can you tell me from that graph by how much? Not in dollar terms, but just in the areas.
area D?
Area D,
A, right?
A.
Oh, could be A.
Anyone else? It's going to be A plus B plus C plus D. All of this will be loss to the consumer. In other words, the consumer will find that their surplus has been reduced by the amounts A plus B plus C plus D.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
In like concepts of like economics, we're given the demand and supply curves, and consumer surplus is shown as in this situation. Why I answered A. That's like the way we were like taught. Why would we take into place or into consideration B, C, and D as well if we're taught to just deal with what's within G, E, and A?
Now, remember when we defined consumer surplus, how did we define it? Well, first of all, let's look at, because we're trying to find the change in consumer surplus. So what I want to do here is I want to look at the consumer surplus under free trade, consumer surplus under tariff, right? To be able to determine the change. So let me look at consumer surplus with free trade. With free trade, this is the market price. This is the price right there. So consumer surplus is going to be the area of all of this triangle right here. Everyone got that?
Yes.
Free trade. Okay. Now, let me look at consumer surplus with tariff. With tariff, this is the new price right there. So consumer surplus is going to be the area of the triangle above the 9,000 mark, all the way up to here. This would be the new consumer surplus. So now, what is the change in consumer surplus? Consumer surplus was reduced by how much?
A, B, and C and D.
Very good. That's exactly what we've said. So consumer surplus will be reduced by A, B, C, and D.
I don't think that answered my question. Or is it a different perspective we're taking? Because normally we take the supply curve into account. Why are we not taking the supply curve into account with this?
Well, we're only talking about consumer surplus, not producer surplus.
Okay, so
We're looking at the change in consumer, because the question was posed, what is the change in consumer surplus?
okay, so in this instance, we're not taking producer surplus into consideration, whereas in principles we would take into consideration both. Is that
Yeah,
right?
absolutely, yeah, yeah. But sometimes when we want to look at producer surplus, in other words, what would be the effect of the tariff on producer surplus?
It would increase by A, right?
Exactly. It will increase by A, which is exactly what the consumer is going to be losing. Okay? So from that point of view, I really don't need to look at producer surplus because that would be contained in the consumer surplus. You see what I'm saying here?
Okay, I think it's just like the change of perspective. Like we're not taking into account the supply curve. We're just the consumers. We only care about the demand. Is that what's
No, no,
happening?
no. Here, because what we're, in other words, both consumer surplus and producer surplus are important. Now, the reason why we are focusing on the consumer surplus is because whatever happens to the producer surplus will be part of the consumer surplus. In other words, when we look at the producer surplus as a result of the tariff, we see that the producer surplus has actually increased by A, correct?
Right.
And A is already part of the consumer surplus. Yeah, so we really don't need to look at producer surplus because then we will simply be double counting, so to speak. So we don't have to do that because everything that we need to know about the producer surplus or change in the producer surplus will already be computed or calculated under the change in consumer surplus. So to make our work easier, we're simply going to focus on consumer surplus rather than on producer surplus to avoid double counting here. Why do we need to do that? When everything can be summarized in terms of change in consumer surplus. In other words, what I could do is I could say, okay, I'm going to have three players, the government, the consumer, and the producer. And I know the tariff is going to affect all three. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to see by how much our producer is going to be better off, by how much the government is going to be better off, and by how much the consumer will be better off or worse off. And then add all those up to find what the net impact would be. Now, instead of taking that route, which is pretty long, I'm going to take a shortcut. And I'm going to say, let me see what the tariff would do to the consumer, by how much it will reduce the consumer surplus, and then I know that part of that loss of consumer surplus is going to go to producers, is going to go to the government, etc. So just taking the shortcut, you focus on consumer surplus, basically. And from here we know that the fall in consumer surplus will be equal to A plus B plus C plus D. Now, for each one of this, there is a special term that we use to define those areas. So area A is defined as the redistributive effect of the tariff. Now, what does redistributive effect means? It simply means that this part of the consumer surplus that will be lost by the consumer will be redistributed to producers. So consumers are going to be worse off by this amount A, and producers are going to be better off by this amount A. So plus A minus A is what?
0, right?
0. Very good. So now I don't have to worry about this in as far as the real impact on economic welfare, because it washes out, it offsets one another. Consumer will be worse off by area A. Producer will be better off by area A. And we call that the redistributive effect. Okay, let's come now to area B. What is area B? Area B is simply referred to as the protective effect. What does that mean? Protective effect. It simply means that when the government imposes a tariff, it is imposing that tariff to protect domestic industry from competition. That's why we call this the protective effect. Now, what will this protective effect cost us? How much will it cost the economy to protect this inefficient industry? Well, we know that before the tariff was imposed, producers were only producing 20 units. After the tariff, producers increased their production to 40 units. So in fact, this distance right here represents the increase in production. So look at this triangle right here. The base of the triangle, what does it represent? I just said it. What does it represent?
20.
The
Which is
increased production.
very good. That's what I want to hear. The increase in production. Now we know that producers are inefficient. So when they are increasing their production from 20 to 40, will this hurt our economy?
That's a benefit, right?
Will it hurt our economy when they increase production? In as far as the allocation, the efficient allocation of resources is concerned.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Why? This is the answer. Why? The reason is simply because domestic firms do not have a competitive advantage in producing autos. They are inefficient. So why should they lure scarce resources, limited scarce resources, into producing something that they are inefficient in? They should release these resources to go to producing those goods that we are efficient in. That's the reason why when you impose a tariff to protect this inefficient industry, you are actually going to hurt the economy by promoting the use of scarce resources towards the production of inefficient goods. In other words, when domestic producers are increasing production from 20 to 40, for each extra unit that they will produce, it will cost more than 8,000. So this will cost probably 8,100. This much will cost 8,300. This much will cost 8,400, as determined by the domestic supply curve. 35, if we produce 35, it will probably cost $8,500. To produce 39, it may cost $8,900, and so on. So each extra unit that we will produce will end up costing us more than it would if we had to import them from outside or buy them in the world market. Because we can buy them at $8,000 a piece. Why should we produce them here and then allocate resources to the tune of 8,100, 8,200, 8,300, 8,500, 8,600, all the way up to 9,000? Just doesn't make any sense. So all of this would be a loss, and this loss will be measured by the area of this triangle. And we will call this the protective effect of the tariff. So it doesn't make any sense to impose a tariff on a good that we have no competitive advantage in producing it. We might as well buy it from outside at a very low price rather than putting precious resources for producing it here at home. So if we're going to produce 20 more extra, that's exactly how much we will be losing in our scarce resources. Now we come to Area C. What is Area C? Area C simply refers to the revenue effect of the tariff, meaning the government will be getting this part of consumer surplus in tariff revenues. Because we will be importing this much, as we said, and we will be paying this much tariff on each of them. So in this case, we are importing how many cars did we say? How many cars are we importing?
20?
20. And how much tariff are we paying on each one?
1,000.
1,000.
Therefore, the total revenues from the tariff would be equal to 20,000, which is 20 times 1,000. So this whole area is equivalent to $20,000. And this $20,000 that used to be consumer surplus is now government tariff revenues. Okay, now we go to Area D. Area D is referred to as the consumption effect of the tariff, which means that once we impose a tariff on this good, we're going to be reducing consumption or purchase of this good by consumers. In other words, consumers were actually willing to pay a little bit higher than 8,000 for each unit that they will consume extra. In other words, before, consumers under free trade were consuming 80. With the tariff, they're consuming 60. So obviously the consumer, as a result of the tariff, were prevented from purchasing 20 extra autos, which is this distance right here of the triangle, 20. That's how much less consumers are purchasing of automobiles. Now, consumers, if let's say they were given a chance to consume, let's say 59 autos. So let's say we were somewhere here, 59, okay? Very close to 60, 59. Consumers are actually willing to pay a little bit higher than the world price of 8,000 to buy those 59 autos, but they were prevented from doing so because of the tariff. They can't. Also, consumers are still willing to pay still a little bit higher than 8,000 if they were to consume, let's say, 55 autos. But again,
Wait, Professor, that's 80.
what's that?
That quantity is 80, not
80, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, good. 80. So let's say, for example, they want to consume 78. They are willing to pay a little bit higher than 8,000, but they can't do it because of the tariff. Or let's say they were interested in consuming, let's say, 70 autos. They were actually willing to pay a much higher price of maybe 8,700. But again, they are not permitted to do that. So you can see consumers were willing to pay a little bit higher for each one of those autos that they were initially prevented from consuming, but they were not allowed to do so because of the tariff. So this is known as the consumption effect. It has a negative consumption effect on the consumer. You could have made the consumer better off by giving them the opportunity to consume more, and they are willing even to pay a higher price than the world price. But you decided you're not going to allow them to do that. And it's simply going to be $9,000 or nothing, basically. So they either come up with 9,000 or they're not going to be able to consume anything. And this obviously hurts consumers' utility or satisfaction. So that's what the tariff does. Therefore, the effect of the tariff can be defined in terms of a redistributive effect, protective effect, revenue effect, consumption effect. Those are the four effects of the tariff. However, the real cost of the tariff to the economy is simply B plus D, which we call the dead weight loss. The dead weight loss is simply defined as the destruction of value. In other words, these values completely vanish. They disappear. Nobody gets them. The consumer loses them, and they're gone forever. Whereas this one right here, the consumer loses, yes, but guess what? The producer will get it. So it's not a destroyed value. Someone in the economy is getting it. Same thing with C. Yes, the consumer will lose this part from their consumer surplus. But then again, the government will get this part. So it is not destroyed. It still remains within the economy. So A and C, even though the consumer loses them from their consumer surplus, however, they are still retained within the economy. The only thing that is lost forever, disappears, is destroyed, are B and D, which we call dead weight loss. That's what we mean by dead weight loss. Destruction of value. Value destroyed forever. Nobody gets it. So if you were asked to find the real cost of the tariff in the exam, then what will your answer be? The real cost of the tariff is equal to what?
B and D.
B and D. That's it. How about if you were asked to find what is the change in consumer surplus as a result of the tariff? What would be your answer?
A, B, C, and D.
Very good. A, B, C, and D. That would be the change in consumer surplus. Okay, suppose you were asked to find the redistributive effect. What is that?
A,
And how would you measure A? How would you compute it, calculate it?
it will be use 20 times 1,000 plus 20 times 1,000 divided by 2. That area divide, you can put into the two sections. One is rectangular and one is triangle. Am I right or wrong?
Well, you're right, but I don't know where you get the 20,000 from.
No, 20.
Oh,
20 is the quantity of the 20,
yeah.
and then 1,000 is
So what
9,000 minus 8,000 equal 1,000.
what you're doing is you're drawing a line up.
Yeah,
Yeah, finding the area,
yeah,
square, and then finding the area of this
a
triangle.
triangle. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the easiest way to do it is simply take the area of this rectangle. Okay?
Oh, okay.
And then
Yeah.
subtract from it the area of this triangle, because you're going to be working with this triangle anyway, so you already know what the area of this triangle is, rather than drawing another line and finding the area of another triangle. We don't need to do that. So just take this whole area right here, which is equal to 40 times 1,000. That's 40 right here, times 1,000, which is this distance. Okay, so that will give us 40,000.
I have a question.
Yes.
The B section that you said is a dead weight loss, wouldn't that be the cost of production, which would actually go back into like the employees' pockets?
Well, no, because what we're doing here is we're saying that what would be the effect of the tariff on, you see, this part right here is how much of that will go. You're saying that, okay, if, for example, this is how much is produced, then this would go to the employee. Yes, you're right, but at what cost? This is the question we're trying to answer. At what cost?
At the cost of D.
No, at the cost of this right here, because this producer is producing it at a much higher cost than we can actually get it from overseas. See, I think what you're doing here is you're missing the point. The point here is we want to use our resources efficiently. We could either use those resources in producing goods that we have a competitive advantage in, or we could use those resources in producing goods that we have no competitive advantage in. So from an economic point of view, you actually want to use resources in producing those goods that you have a competitive advantage. Yes, if domestic producers produce this much, they're going to be pocketing that money. That's true. But they have actually used resources very inefficiently when they pocketed that money. So is this process economical or not? This is the question I want to answer. And the answer is no. Why? Because these producers could have used those resources in producing something else that they are efficient in, and they could have made a lot more than producing something that we could have gotten from overseas at a much lower price. So this triangle right here, all what it is doing, it's simply finding the difference between producing these quantities, the 20 right here that we have, the difference between producing them at home and producing them overseas. Does this make sense?
Yeah. When you said dead weight loss, though, it just kind of made me confused.
Yeah, that's basically what we're trying to find out. In other words, yes, you're right. Producers are producing 20 and they're charging 9,000 and they're pocketing that money. That's true. However, what we want to do here is we want to compare these resources that these producers are using to produce the 20 with using them somewhere else where we can actually make 100 times more probably than what producers have made here. So this really takes us to the economic problem here, which is trying to find if this is economical or not. To find whether it is economical or not, all what we need to do is simply compare the resources that domestic producers are using to produce this quantity of goods with what foreign producers would use to produce this amount of good. And the difference, of course, is a loss to us as a nation, because we could have used these scarce resources in producing something else and making more money rather than producing something we're inefficient in. In other words, we could have very easily gotten this quantity from abroad at only 8,000 a piece. But for these quantities to be produced at home, this is exactly how much it would cost to produce each extra unit, as determined by the domestic supply curve. Does this answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously it's not economical to produce it at home because it's inefficient. It's going to cost us more. Okay, so that's basically everything that we need to know in as far as the effect of the tariff. The real cost of the tariff, as I said, is simply B plus D. That's the real cost. The change in consumer surplus is simply A, B, C, and D. We were able to determine A. Now let's see B. How do we determine B? Simply half base times height. The base of this triangle is 20. The height is 1,000. So 20 times 1,000, that's 20,000. Half of that is 10. So obviously the protective effect will end up costing us $10,000. The revenue effect, obviously, is going to go to the government in terms of tariff revenues. Again, it is simply the quantity imported, which is 20, 60 minus 40, times 1,000. So 20 times 1,000 is $20,000 goes in tariff revenues. Consumption effect, again, it's the area of this little triangle. Half base times height. The base is 20, the height is 1,000. So 20 times 1,000, that's 20,000. Half of that is 10,000. Any questions on this small country?
What is D defined as again? Sorry.
What's that?
What is D defined as again?
Defined as the consumption effect.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And what about A?
A is the redistributive effect. And I guess, your book obviously goes over those, so we can go over them. The revenue effect, the redistributive effect, it's all explained for you right there. I mean, I'm not going to go over them because we already talked about them, so, there's no need to repeat myself. Protective effect, consumption effect, deadweight loss. Everyone knows what deadweight loss is? Anyone?
It was area B and D,
Mm-hmm. And what does it
and
mean?
it's not like it's not like it's like completely lost. It doesn't go back into the economy.
Very good. So it's actually destruction of value. So in this case, value is completely destroyed. It evaporates into thin air. And you're not going to be able to see it again. That's what we mean by deadweight loss. It's gone forever. Okay, again, the author explains, the revenue effect in terms of the areas, area C, the redistributive effect, area A, and it tells you it's simply the transfer of consumer surplus to domestic producers or the transfer of income from consumers to producers. Either way is fine, says the same thing. Protective effect, loss to the domestic economy. We talked about that. In other words, remember, it's the wasted resources used to produce additional goods at increasing unit costs. Less efficient domestic production replaces more efficient foreign production. This will lead to loss of welfare. So, I mean, we explained all of that. And again, as I said, I don't want to repeat myself, but hopefully by now, you know exactly what we mean by all of that. Consumption effect is the residual not accounted for elsewhere, meaning the loss of welfare arises from increased price, lower consumption, deadweight loss, simply area B plus D, protective effect plus consumption effect. Well, we explained all of that. Any questions so far? Okay, let's continue then. Now let's look at the large country model. And let's see, once a large country imposes a tariff, how will that tariff affect that particular country? In other words, what we are trying to find out here is there a change or is there a difference between a large country imposing a tariff and a small country imposing a tariff? And you will find out from this new model that we will look at, yes, there is a huge change. And there are more terms that we will familiarize ourselves with. So instead of having the redistributive effect, the protective effect, the revenue effect, the consumption effect, now we will have one more effect added. And that will be the terms of trade effect. Terms of trade effect. We will explain that. So now, what does this mean, a large nation? A large nation is simply defined as a nation that is large enough in terms of its imports that it can actually influence the world price of imports. A good example of a large nation would be the US. The US is such a huge market for imports. In other words, if you look at the value of imports that the US imports on a yearly basis is probably in 2019 was close to maybe $3.6 trillion. That's a lot of money the US spends on imports. Because of that, the US can influence the price of imported goods. Why? Let's say, for example, the US is importing cars from Japan, and Japan happens to depend a lot on the US market for its auto exports. Now, let's say the US decides to impose a tariff on Japanese cars. Japanese firms will know that this increase in tariff by the US would increase the price to US consumers. And when the price increases, what will happen to the demand for Japanese cars?
It goes down.
Reduce.
Goes down. So now, do you think Japanese firms are going to be happy with the tariff?
No.
Absolutely. So what will the Japanese firms do here is that they will use a strategy known as counteracting the tariff. What does this mean? This simply means in order to offset some of the effect of the tariff, Japanese firms will reduce the price of their exports, which is the price of imports for the US. So let's say, for example, the world price of imports for cars, Japanese cars, to the US happens to be $8,000. And the US decides to impose a $1,000 tariff. This will lead to the new price to be exactly equal to 9,000. Everyone follows? I guess someone is having difficulties following what I'm saying. I repeat, suppose the world price of autos is $8,000 and the US decides to impose $1,000 tariff. So what would be the new price now?
9,000.
9,000. Okay. What Japanese firms can do in this case is instead of charging $8,000, they could charge 7,000. So now when they charge 7,000 and the US imposes a $1,000 tariff, what would be the new price?
8,000 still.
8,000.
Very good, 8,000. Therefore, Japan now is successful in not affecting the demand for their cars. How did they do that?
Reduce their price.
By reducing their price. Very good. So this is one strategy that large nations can use, and they will say, okay, if we put a tariff on this good, since we are a large nation and we can place a threat, if you will, to the exporting country simply because we are a large importer of their good. They depend a lot on our market. And if we put a tariff, we're going to increase the price. And if we increase the price, we're going to reduce the demand for their product. And obviously, they're not going to be happy to see a reduction in the demand for their product. So we will force them to reduce the price. And this is exactly what happens when a country is large enough that it can influence the price. It will make that tariff work in its favor. Now, obviously, every tariff imposed will lead to economic inefficiency. Economic inefficiency is defined by deadweight loss. So every tariff will have a deadweight loss. You can't escape deadweight loss from imposing a tariff. What a large country can do to make this tariff work in its favor is to get the exporting country to reduce its price by an adequate amount, in which case the terms of trade will turn in favor of the importing country so that the gain from the terms of trade will more than offset the deadweight loss. If that happens, then the large nation imposition of the tariff will work in its favor. And we will explain this in just a minute, but I just want to give you an idea of where we're going, where we're heading with this large country imposing a tariff. Now, with a large country imposing a tariff, things are going to change a little bit. And you can, talk about all, you can read all of that. We have already talked about them, but this is what's important right here, the model, the graph, because the graph will explain everything that we need to explain here. You see that this, first of all, this model is more complicated than the small country model, right? More things involved. Now, as far as the domestic demand and domestic supply, they're pretty much similar. In other words, downward sloping, upward sloping. The point of intersection will determine the autarky price, autarky quantity. Now, this large country does not face a perfectly elastic world supply. This country now will face an upward sloping world supply curve. It is obviously, as you can see, more flatter than the domestic supply. The domestic supply is much steeper. The world supply plus domestic supply is much flatter. Why? For the simple reason because the large country domestic supply of automobile is rather limited in quantities. There is only so much they can produce, so the supply curve is pretty much inelastic. Whereas when we look at the world supply curve, the world is much larger than the US as a whole. And as you can see from here, that there can be a lot more supplied worldwide. In other words, the price elasticity of supply is much higher here than it is there. This is more elastic. This is more inelastic. Everyone got that so far? If you need any explanation, now is the time to ask. Okay. So this is the supply curve, world supply. Now where the world supply and the demand curve intersect, that will give us the new equilibrium under free trade. So now free trade between the large country and the rest of the world, in this case we're just taking US and Japan, you will see that the world price will be determined at 6,000 and the quantities of cars purchased in the US will be 110. At this price, the US will only produce 30 cars. So how many will the US import?
80.
80, very good, which is 110 minus 30. That's how much the US will import. Now, what will be the change in consumer surplus if, for example, we happen to impose a $1,000 tariff on autos? Well, the first thing that we need to do is we need to shift this world supply upward by 1,000. In other words, the vertical distance between these 2 points must be exactly equal to 1,000. Between this point and this point, 1,000. Between this point and this point, 1,000. And so on. In other words, the supply curve, the world supply curve, will have to pretty much shift up by exactly $1,000. So now we will have two supply curves, the original supply curve and the new supply curve with the tariff. And the distance between them, the vertical distance between these two supply curves is going to be exactly equal to $1,000. And this is exactly what we have right there. So now once we have done that, then we're going to determine where the equilibrium point will be between the new supply and the demand. And as you can see, it's at point G. So at point G, the price will be exactly equal to 8,800. And the quantities purchased will be equal to 80. Again, at the price of 8,800, how much will be produced at home? This will be determined by the domestic supply. So I'm going to have a point right there on the domestic supply. And this will be equivalent to how many cars produced at home. How many cars?
50.
50. So what will be our imports?
40.
What's that?
40. 90 minus 50.
Yeah, 40. Very good. 40. 90 minus 50. So this is basically how much we will be importing right here. This distance right there. That's how much we will be importing. And now you can see that the $1,000 tariff is not paid by the consumer as we saw in the small country model. Because under the small country model, the consumer will end up paying all of the tariff. But under a large country model, it's going to be both the consumer and the foreign producer. Because remember, the foreign producer is going to take a cut in the price to avoid the tariff from destroying the demand for its product. So the foreign producer is willing to take a cut in the price. And as a result, the foreign producer will contribute to the payment of the tariff. Now, what will be the burden of the tariff? In other words, how much of the tariff will the consumer pay? How much of the tariff will the foreign producer pay? All of that will depend on the elasticity of demand and supply. It depends on how this is drawn. Is it drawn very flat, or is it drawn a little bit steeper or a little bit flatter? Or same thing with demand. How is demand drawn? Is it drawn flatter, steeper? All of these things will determine how much of the tariff will be paid by the consumer and how much of the tariff will be paid by the producer. So given the elasticities, or given the shapes of the demand and supply, we are able to determine from here that out of this $1,000 tariff, the consumer will pay $800 and the producer will pay how much?
200.
200. Because remember, the producer before received $8,000. Now the producer is only receiving $7,800. So the producer is paying, the foreign producer is paying $200 of that tariff. Consumer was paying $8,000 before. Now the consumer is paying $8,800. So the consumer is paying $800 in tariff. So the tariff is divided between them. So you can see from here, 7,800 to 8,800, the difference is 1,000, correct? Which is the tariff. So the consumer is paying all of this, and the producer is paying just this much. So this is one thing that we learn from a large country, that the supply curve is no longer perfectly elastic, that the producer, foreign producer, is willing to take a price cut to preserve a good chunk of its sales of autos to the US. And what would happen is that the consumer in the US will not end up paying for all the tariff, will only pay part, and the producer will pay part. And also from here we know that the terms of trade have turned in favor of the US. Why? Because remember how we defined the terms of trade as simply the price of export divided by the price of import. Here, of course, we're talking about indexes. Export price index divided by the import price index. Now, for the US, the terms of trade is the price of exports over the price of imports. So let's assume that the price of exports for the US stays the same, because we're really not dealing with the export of the US. So we can safely assume that prices of exports are the same. However, the price of imports for the US, what happened to the price of imports for the US? What happened to the price of automobiles? Forget the tariff, without the tariff. You go down, up. Look at those two numbers. How much are Japanese producers getting for their cars?
$7,800.
And before they were getting 8,000, so they were willing to reduce the price of automobiles. Therefore, the price of imports for the US has fallen. The price of exports for the US has stayed the same. So what has happened to the terms of trade for the US? Improved, right? Because the price of exports divided by the price of imports has increased. So the terms of trade index has improved. When it increases, it improves. When it falls, it deteriorates, it worsens. Now, how are we going to measure the terms of trade effect? That terms of trade effect is measured by this little rectangle E, because Japan will be exporting this much after the tariff, and the US will be importing this much after the tariff. And Japan will be paying this much of the tariff. So obviously the government is gonna get all of this in tariff revenues. C plus E is the total tariff revenues the government gets. However, C is the tariff that is paid by consumers. E is the tariff paid by foreign producers. So this E right here, we refer to it as the terms of trade effect. Now, if I find that area E is greater than B plus D, then I know that the tariff that the US imposed is working in favor of the US. This is the only way where the tariff will have a positive impact on the economic welfare if E happens to be greater than B plus T. But remember, this E happens only when we are dealing with a large country. This E will never exist for a small country. Therefore, for a small country, a tariff will always have a negative impact. There will always be real cost, negative real costs. Whereas for a large country, it is possible for the real costs of the tariff to dissipate. If,
Professor,
yes,
I really hate to cut you off, but I just wanted to remind you of the time. It's 3:52.
Thank you very much. So we will stop right there. We'll stop right there. Anyone has any questions, please let me know. So for those of you
Thank
who
you.
leave, you can leave right now, but those who want to stay, they have a question or two, you're more than welcome.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, have a good day, all of you, and I'll see you on Thursday or on Wednesday, office hours.